Let's take a look at exam technique on the ACCA SBR ethics question. I will use a March 2020 past exam question, Bagshot, to illustrate. So you may want to pause the video and just read through that question. Now, the ACCA syllabus and study guide does state that the second question in section A, worth 20 marks, will require candidates to consider the reporting implications and the ethical implications of specific events in the contemporary scenario. So, friends, your question 2 will have two elements. It will have the reporting implications, meaning your IFRSs, and then the ethical implications, which will stem from those IFRSs. Okay, so it's 20 marks. Roughly, the ethics will be somewhere between 5 to 10 marks. Okay, out of the 20. So if I just use this question to illustrate that point, what the study guide is basically saying, you have to deal with ethical implications. You have to deal with the ethical implications, and then you have to deal with the reporting issues. So your IFRS. Okay. So friends, it goes without saying that without your knowledge of IFRS, you will find it difficult to answer the ethical implications, because the two will be linked. The two parts will be linked. Okay, so it will be the IFRS issues happening normally in part A, and then the ethical implications. For this session, our focus is how do we approach the ethical implications. Okay, so I'm not going to spend time on part A. Our main issue is in fact part B, looking at how we deal with the ethical issues. So the requirement for part B is identify and discuss the ethical issues arising from the scenario which Mr. Shaw needs to consider, and what actions he should take as a consequence. So you need to do a number of things. Identify the ethical issues. Okay, identify and discuss the ethical issues arising from the scenario which Mr. Shaw needs to consider, and what actions need to be taken. So our chief character is Mr. Shaw. Always, friends, have in mind the number of marks available. Okay, it's so easy to go overboard on an ethical question, because there's normally more than one way you can answer the question in terms of the number of issues can actually come up. But you don't have the time to write all the issues in the final exam. Like in this case, it's 5 marks. And you're doing the identification, look at the ethical issues, and then you're suggesting the actions to be taken. Okay? All that, in this case, for 5 marks. As I said, some questions it could go as much as 10 marks. Okay? So always be mindful of how much you need to write. So the marks here are a guide of the points that you're looking at. Okay, it's 5 marks to this question. Okay, so as I said, we're not doing part A, but I'll just summarize basically what is happening in part A, because that is needed to answer part B. So part A is that, so in the exam, this could be any IFRS. In this case, it was provisions. Okay, it was basically the accounting treatment for restructuring costs. So the main standard, the main IFRS was IS 37 in this case. Okay, so this could be anything. It could be on financial instruments, it could be related parties, it could be something on cash flow. So it could be any reporting issue in IFRS. So you have to be very comfortable for you to be then able to answer the follow-up question, which would be the ethical side. Okay, so hope you pause the video, friend, and read through the question. So just highlight the chief characters. So our concern is we're looking at this from Mr. Shaw's perspective, who is the head accountant, okay, of Bagshot. There is the CEO, Mrs. Dawes. There's Mike Starr, the nephew of Mr. Shaw, and there's Mrs. Shaw's wife. Okay. So these are the issues. So basically, in part A, the chief executive, who is Mrs. Dawes, was basically insisting that a restructuring be made. Okay, so Mrs. Dawes was insistent that Mr. Shaw should include a restructuring provision for all the expenditure in the financial statements. Okay. Now, in short, then did they meet the criteria in IS 37? Grounds for making a provision. Okay. So the short answer to that, friends, is no. They did not meet the criteria for the provision. Basically because they had not communicated, okay? They had not communicated the restructuring plans to those to be affected. So then there was no constructive obligation, because you have to start the restructuring or actually communicate to those who will be affected. So this was not the case. The restructuring plan had not been communicated to those to be affected. So then there was no grounds for provision. Okay, because you have to be committed. You don't just make a provision when you're not committed. So which is the whole basis of IS 37, grounds for making a provision. So the ethical issue you can see here is Mrs. Dawes insistent. So Mrs. Dawes is the CEO, insistent that Mr. Shaw makes a provision. So this is putting undue pressure on Mr. Shaw. Okay, so you can look at this as now intimidation, which could affect the objectivity of Mr. Shaw when preparing the financial statement. Okay, so that was one of the issues. The other issue which was important is Mr. Shaw is considering informing his wife of the proposed restructuring. Now, the restructuring has been made confidential at the moment, so it hasn't been publicly announced. Okay, Mr. Shaw is one of the employees who has been notified. Now, the wife has recently acquired shares, so she's an investor. So Mr. Shaw is considering informing the wife. So that's another ethical issue in terms of now confidentiality. You're not supposed to disclose information which has come to you in the course of your duties unless you're authorized to do so or it's in the public interest. Because now disclosing to the wife who is an investor may bring issues of insider dealing. Okay, so basically those are the issues. So when approaching this question, you need to identify the accounting principle which has been breached, okay, and the ethical issue. You need to identify. Now, be very careful. We are looking at part B here, okay? Part A has already done the explanation of the IFRS IS 37 and why the criteria is not met. That has already been done in Part A. Okay, so in B, you're not starting to explain all that again. You just identify. Okay, you simply identify, because the explanations of the accounting issue have already been done in Part A. So the conclusion from Part A is no provision. Okay, but the CEO is insistent. So this is the issue now. Is insistent that Mr. Shaw should include restructuring provision in the financial statements. Okay, so the analysis has already been done in Part A. The criteria is in fact not being met. Okay, so that is one problem. The second issue is the structuring plans have not been made public. Mr. Shaw is one of the employee who has been notified. Okay, but now Mr. Shaw is considering informing his wife, who is an investor. She has recently made a 5% investment in Bagshot. So these are the issues. So that's the first thing, identify the issues. Next, you then need, once you've identified, okay, there's incorrect treatment here that in terms of the accounting, I've also identified there's some ethical issues. You now need to mention and explain the ACCA's ethical principles which have been breached. So only those which are relevant to the scenario. Okay. Now, this is where you have to be very careful considering the number of marks available. Okay. This question is only 5 marks, the ethical bit. Now, you need to specifically mention that this ACCA ethical principle has been breached. You have to specifically mention that. Okay. You are told in the scenario that the two chief characters here are in fact members of ACCA. Okay. Mr. Shaw is an ACCA member, as well as Mrs. Dawes, the CEO. She's also a ACCA member. Okay. So they all need to comply with ACCA ethical guidelines and act responsibly, okay, according to ACCA's ethical guidelines. Now, we then need to identify which of ACCA's principles have been breached. So these are the issues. We've identified the issues here, okay. You'll probably get a mark for that. In this case, because the question is only is only 5 marks, you probably just get a mark for that. Okay. You then now need to explain the ethical principles which have been breached. So you can use copy to remind you of the principles. You need to know this. Okay, you need to know what they stand for. So this is confidentiality, objectivity, professional competence and care, professional behavior, and integrity. Okay. So there's obviously the issue of confidentiality from this issue here. There's the issue of confidentiality. So you have to explain. So I'm not explaining this in full. So I'm just kind of doing an answer plan. Okay. So friends, you have to explain there's the issue of confidentiality. Mr. Shaw must not disclose the information on the proposed restructuring to the wife. Okay, so must not disclose without authority. So that's the main issue here. So SCC's principle here requires that must not disclose unless there is a legal requirement or it's in the public interest to do so. Okay, friends, so this is the principle. So must not disclose what? You have to say must not, you apply, must not disclose. You have to apply. So don't just put the book knowledge, okay? Must not disclose the information. You have to say the information on restructuring, because that's the issue to the wife. Okay? So you have to explain that. So that's one principle being affected. Okay? So you do a paragraph for that. Objectivity. Objectivity will be another one. Okay, now you need to know what is meant, friends, by objectivity. So no bias or undue influence. Now, objectivity here is being threatened. Okay, no bias or undue interest. You need to know what it means. Okay, now objectivity is being threatened here. There is an intimidation threat. From Mrs. Dawes. Insistent. Again, I'm not finishing this. I'm just, friends, just picking up the points, the plan. Okay. From Mrs. Dawes insistent that Mr. Shaw makes a provision. So that is intimidation, because now that's putting undue pressure on Mr. Shaw. Okay. So there's the issue of intimidation threat, which will affect objectivity. There's also the issue of self-interest. Because of on Mr. Shaw, because of Mr. Shaw's relationships. Okay, Mr. Shaw has a wife and the nephew, and has a nephew. So a nephew who's going to be affected by the redundancy, and the wife who has made investment in the company. So the disclosure of wanting to disclose this information to the wife and possibly then to the nephew, this is a self-interest threat, because now Mr. Shaw is vested in this, being that the wife is an investor. Okay, so that brings about the issue of a self-interest threat, and which is unfair. Because the wife being an investor, there's a possible issue here of insider dealing. She can make investment decisions knowing what will happen as far as the restructuring is concerned. Meanwhile, the other shareholders, the other potential investors, do not have that privileged information. Okay, so that is the threat which is here in terms of self-interest. So that's how objectivity will be affected. Okay. Other threats, friends, would also come in. You'd look at professional competence. Okay. Professional competence. In terms of the provision, if Mrs. Dawes, who is insisting, if she's not aware, if she's not aware of IS 37 criteria for restructuring provision, and that this criteria has not been met, there's no obligation, because the restructuring plans have not been communicated to those to be affected. If she's not aware of the criteria in IS 37, then now that raises the issue of professional competence. Okay, that raises the issue of professional competence. On the other hand, if she's actually aware and she's doing this deliberately, so she's deliberately, she knows that the criteria is not being met, but deliberately she's insisting that a provision is met, then the issue of integrity comes into question. Honesty. Okay? The issue of integrity will come into question, because now if she's doing this on purpose, that's now a lack of honesty in her professional dealings. Okay? In most questions, almost this professional competence and integrity will almost come up, because it's an issue of depending again on the question, but generally, if you don't know what the IFRS says, so it's an honest mistake, then it's lack of professional competence. But if you're doing it deliberately, then it's the issue of integrity. Okay. So now you can see, friends, of the 5 ethical guidelines, we have 4 of them in that you can easily write on in this scenario. There's obvious confidentiality, the issue of objectivity, professional competence, okay, the issue of integrity. Okay, you may argue professional behavior if the profession is going to be brought into disrepute. So it's very much possible that all 5 would apply. Okay, but remember, this question is only 5 marks. So basically here, you'd probably get 2 marks in this case. Okay, there'll probably be a mark for identifying the issue. There'll probably be 2 marks here. So in the exam, we probably just want to focus on the main ones, and from the issues identified, friends, the main ones are the issue of confidentiality, wanting to inform the wife, definitely the issue of confidentiality. Then the this pressure being put on Mr. Shaw, it questions objectivity. Okay, it questions objectivity because Mr. Shaw now is being intimidated. You'd argue those would be the two main ones if now we are under time pressure. But obviously others can easily come in, as we can see. Is this on purpose? Then it's integrity. Is this a lack of knowledge of IS 37? Then it's a issue of competence. All right. So just be careful in the exam. Okay, how much do I have to write? Okay. Obviously, remember your exam is a typing exam. You have to type, yeah. So just remember how much how much do you have to write depending on the marks available. Because there'll probably be a mark for identification, about 2 marks on the ACCA ethical guide principles that have been breached. Okay. And then finally, friends, the relevant actions. You need to make clear, logical, and appropriate recommendations for the actions. Okay. This should be practical. Practical, appropriate here, basically emphasizing practical recommendations. Okay. Don't go overboard. So what can be done? Okay, what can Mr. Shaw do here? Always when recommending, try to look at, are there internal solutions before you think of external remedies? Is there something internally that can be done? Okay. So the main issues here, there's the issue of Mr. Dawes putting pressure, insisting that a provision be made. Now, Mrs. Dawes is a member of ACCA. Okay, so she's bound by ACCA's ethical code. So remind her of her professional responsibility. Okay, being an ACCA member, reminder of her professional responsibility. Okay, basically here what you're saying is it doesn't meet the criteria for a provision, so a provision can't be made. And obviously doing that is going against the ACCA's principles in terms of integrity. So reminder of her professional responsibility. Okay. Now, what do you do if she's insisting? She continue putting pressure. Is an audit committee that you may report to. Okay. Report to audit committee. Report the matter to the audit committee. Okay. That's one. That's a step that can be taken. That can be taken. Okay. If she's not aware of the treatment in IS 37, then recommend maybe training or continuous professional development, CPD training, if it's an issue of lack of competence. Okay. So be very practical. You get now about the other 2 marks from here, from the actions that can be taken. Okay. So don't go to the extreme when you're recommending. Okay. Don't start right away start thinking of the extreme measures basically which may involve external parties. Okay. Obviously, a bit more extreme measures might involve okay, might take legal advice, maybe not very extreme. You may take legal advice. Okay. You may consider resigning. But this should be coming as a last resort. Okay. So just be mindful of that when you're making recommendations. If nothing is being done, yeah, you take legal advice, you may consider resigning. Okay. But obviously you have to be practical. You resign, you have to be very practical. Obviously you're going to lose income in terms of your salary. Do you have another job? But friends, what I'm trying to say is always think of internal remedies first. You talk to the person, take it to the committee. Okay. Training can be done. Maybe legal advice. All right. So friends, here you have it. That's how we approach questions on ethics. Okay. That's how we approach questions on ethics. So remember, there will be reporting issues. Okay. As in this question, there will be reporting issues, and then there will be the ethical bit. And as we can see from here, you need to deal with the reporting issues, and the ethical issue will come from there. Like, as in this case, it was the issue of the provision. Then we go to the ethical issue, you identify, okay, you've already done the explanation in part A, so you're just identifying the issue. Mention ACCA's ethical principles which have been breached, appropriate recommendations. Be very practical recommendations. Always be mindful of the number of marks, okay? So that you don't write too many, especially when you get to the ACCA's ethical principles. It's so tempting to try and write something on all 5 of them. Look at what are the key ones in the scenario, depending on the marks available. All right, friends, all the best in your exam. Remember to subscribe to the channel for more tips on passing your exams. Cheers.